Everyone, welcome to Sun's Day at Lincoln Lab. I'm Janice McMahon. I'm in the Digital Radar Systems Group, and what I'm going to be talking to you about is basically a follow-up to what Chris told you about. He told you about how we do the processing to get the information, and I'm going to talk to you about how we might go about building one of those systems that actually implements what he talked to you about. Specifically going to go into a little more detail about that computer, the picture that he put up on his last slide. But before I do that, I'll talk to you a little bit about what made me interested in engineering and why I became an engineer. And a lot of the things you see are similar to what Chris had. Early interests, I figured out pretty early that I liked math and science classes better than my other classes. And I liked building things and logic puzzles. And I also got interested in computers at a very early age, about 7th or 8th grade is when I really got interested. And the last one I put up is music, and I think that's kind of interesting. There's a lot of articles in the news lately about the relationship between music and math, and how they're at a very early age they're related in terms of your learning. And I guess the point there is you guys who are interested in math, you may be closet musicians, and vice versa, you guys who are interested in music may actually be mathematicians, so think about that. Also, I had family influence. My father's an inventor, and my parents work with science and math stuff. And similar to you, where you have at least one parent who works at the lab, that kind of thing is nice. It enables me to get exposed to math and science concepts at an early age and take advantage of some of the support. And after that, it was pretty much straight from there. I figured out I wanted to be an engineer, and I got into MIT, and I didn't apply anywhere else, and I went there. And I think some of the other speakers wasn't quite so straightforward. And in fact, I overheard one woman yesterday who was a ballerina before she became an engineer. So you can really do anything you want, and you can take your own time doing it, I guess is the message. So I also have an analogy for building radar systems. On the top here, I'm showing how human vision works. Okay, Chris used sound. I'm going to use vision. You have an object out here, a little cat. What happens is light is reflected off the cat, and the waves travel through the air. They hit your eye. Okay, your eye converts the light wave into a signal, and in this case, it's a chemical electrical signal. And then that signal is sent through nerves to your brain, and your brain actually processes the information. Your brain actually figures out, oh, that's a cat, and puts a label on it and forms a mental image of what the cat looks like. Radar is working in a similar way here. We have an object in space, and instead of light waves, we have waves of electromagnetic energy. And the key point here is that those waves can be described by a mathematical equation. Okay, this is where the math comes in. So the waves travel through the air, and they hit the sensors, as Chris described, which are on an airplane. And inside the airplane, we have something called an A to D, or an analog to digital converter. And don't worry too much about this one. It's doing a lot of the same of what your eye is doing. Okay? It's taking those waves that come through the air, which are described by a mathematical equation, and it's turning them into something that can be understood by a computer. Well, what does a computer understand? A computer understands numbers. Okay? So this box here is translating those waves of energy into sequences of numbers, which can be operated on by a computer. Okay? What comes out of the computer is the answer. I'm calling this a target here. How fast is the target going? How far away is it? What's its angle relative to the airplane here, as Chris showed in his slides? In order to do that job, we have two things going on here. We have to do a lot of math, okay? And we have to get that answer before the target moves too far. Okay, if the target has moved too far away, it doesn't do me any good to get the answer. I really don't know where it is because it's moved far away. And for the kinds of speeds we're talking about, again, it all depends on how fast this guy's going and how fast this guy is going. Really, we want to get the answer within 1/3 of a second. We're going to say that this thing has probably moved out of range within 1/3 of a second. So the point is, I have to do a lot of math on this computer in a very short time. And what that translates to is what I've shown here, 20 billion operations per second. Okay, we've spec'd out our algorithm, and we found that I need a computer right here that can do 20 billion mathematical operations in a second. That's 20 billion adds and multiplies, and I guarantee you that even if you go to school and become an engineer, you're not going to be able to do 20 billion adds and multiplies in a second. So we need a pretty powerful computer that sits right here. And the kind of computers that we're looking at in my group are called parallel computers. And so I'll tell you a little bit about how parallel computers work. Basically here, a single processor, this is like what you have on your desk at home probably, some kind of PC or Macintosh or something. If this is a single processor, then a parallel computer is very simply replicating or having many processors that are connected together by some network, a bunch of wires connecting them together in some way. So the picture on the right here shows a parallel computer with 8 processors. And the idea is that we can solve a mathematical problem faster by having many processors work on it at the same time. So in the picture on the right, whatever problem I choose to do on this parallel processor, it should take 1/8 as long as it takes to do it on this processor. That's the idea behind parallel computers. And on the bottom here, I've shown you kind of an analogy. If I have one tunnel and I have a bunch of cars going through that tunnel, the idea is I can make the traffic go faster if I add a couple of extra tunnels. And I can send a lot of cars through a lot faster because I've got parallelism here. I've got 3 tunnels going in parallel. Now there's a little price I'm paying here, because if I'm going to do this, I'm going to have the 3 tunnels, I need to have some kind of control. I need to have a traffic cop at the entrance here, basically routing the cars, sending all the cars to the correct tunnel. If this traffic cop is asleep, or if he's not paying attention, he may send all the cars to the same tunnel, which doesn't get me any advantage, right? That's the same as the top picture where all the cars go through the same tunnel. So this guy has to be paying attention, he has to be thinking about it, and he has to be making sure that the cars get spread on the 3 tunnels so that they actually do go through faster. So there's a little bit of extra complexity. It's a little bit harder to, you need to make sure you have this guy, and this guy has to take the time to think about it. So it's not quite so straightforward as just throwing a problem on a parallel computer and saying, oh, it's going to take 1/8 as long. It's not quite that simple because I have to think about these kind of issues, the control and the routing of my data. So this slide just kind of gives you an idea of the relative power of parallel computers. I don't know if any of you have a Nintendo 64 at home, but we got these numbers off the web. Your Nintendo 64 can do 100 million operations per second. And that's actually pretty good, even though the square is pretty low there. That's a pretty good number. And your Pentium, if you have a PC at home and it has a Pentium Pro, which is the newest chip, that can do 200 million operations per second. So it can do about twice as much as a Nintendo 64. The red line is a Cray T3E parallel computer with 32 processors. Okay? This thing can do 30 billion operations per second. So now we're in the right range. Now we're talking about the kind of computer that we can feasibly use in our radar system. This is a pretty big difference here. You can imagine having that on your desk at home. And this Cray T3E, what I've shown you is 32 processors. That machine actually will go up to 2,048 processors, which is a pretty big machine. So I didn't even bother to draw that one on my slide because that would have been way up here. So it's pretty impressive. And what are parallel computers used for? What I've shown you, the first one, real-time embedded computing, that's just a fancy way of saying what I've shown you. Real-time means we have to get the answer before the target moves. Embedded means it has to fit on an airplane. Scientific computing, solving physics and math problems in universities. Manufacturing and industrial applications. Databases, insurance companies need to get an answer quickly. They need to look at all their claims and figure out how many were of a certain age limit. In financial analysis, the guys on Wall Street need to know what your stocks are going to do. They need to do a lot of number crunching and a lot of operations in a short time. On my last slide, I'll just show you a picture. This shows a bunch of different parallel computers out there. Something called the Mesh SP, Mercury. IBM, of course, has one, and Intel. Maspar, I worked for this company. That was a neat machine. And then the one that I just showed you is the Cray machine right up here. The picture probably doesn't quite show it. It's about the size of a medium-sized refrigerator. So there are several challenges. The first picture I showed, it has to fit on that airplane. Okay, so one of the big challenges we have is how do we make that thing still be powerful but small enough to fit on the airplane? And if any of you are interested in seeing one of these in real life, I invite you to walk down the Group 102 hallway. We actually have one in a lab in room S2 344 if you want to stop by and take a look at what a 30 billion operation per second computer looks like. So that's about it. If you have any questions, I'll be outside later. And our next speaker is Glenn Moirer, who's going to show you more radar.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's concert, the Funeral Marches of All Souls Day. When Jim Anderson asked me to do this, I asked him what were the qualifications, and he said you had to have a blue suit, preferably one that wasn't new. And as my wife will attest, who's in the audience, none of my suits are new. This concert features some of the most beautiful music ever written by some of the world's greatest composers, which is hardly ever played for obvious reasons. For example, the Mendelssohn piece, which you just heard played so well, was echoed over a half-century later in the funeral march that begins Gustav Mahler's Fifth Symphony. Even so, Mendelssohn's funeral march is far less famous than his wedding march from Midsummer's Night Dream, although the two pieces are strikingly similar. What was he thinking? For example, in the next piece, Beethoven refers to an imaginary Napoleonic hero or an Italian hero. Although this sonata was dedicated to Prince Karl von Lichnowsky, some scholars speculate that the hero was actually the victim of a mining accident, as there is no other reason to write music in A-flat minor, a key with 7 flats. Listen carefully, and you can picture the funeral caissons rolling towards the graveyard. Along the way, the procession stops, drums play, and salutatory shots are fired.